Hello and welcome to the session on Theory of Causation. David Hume 1711 to 1776 is one of the British empiricists of the early modern period along with John Locke and George Berkeley. Although the three advocate similar empirical standards for knowledge, that is, that there are no innate ideas and that all knowledge comes from experience, Hume is known for applying this standard rigorously to causation and necessity. Instead of taking the notion of causation for granted, Hume challenges us to consider what experience allows us to know about cause and effect. Hume shows that experience does not tell us much. Of two events A and B, we say that A causes B when the two always occur together, that is, are constantly conjoined. Whenever we find A, we also find B, and we have a certainty that this conjunction will continue to happen. Once we realize that A must bring about B is tantamount merely to due to their constant conjunction, we are psychologically certain that B will follow A. Then we are left with a very weak notion of necessity. This tenuous grasp on causal efficacy helps give rise to the problem of induction, that we are not reasonably justified in making any inductive inference about the world. Among Hume scholars, it is a matter of debate how seriously Hume means us to take this conclusion and whether causation consists wholly in constant conjunction. Causation's place in Hume's taxonomy. Hume's most important contributions to the philosophy of causation are found in A Treatise of Human Nature and An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, the latter generally viewed as a partial recasting of the former. Both works start with Hume's central empirical axiom known as the copy principle. Loosely, it states that all constituents of our thoughts come from experience. By learning Hume's vocabulary, this can be restated more precisely. Hume calls the contents of the mind perceptions, which he divides into impressions and ideas. Though Hume himself is not strict about maintaining a concise distinction between the two, we may think of impressions as having their genesis in the senses, whereas ideas are products of the intellect. Impressions, which are either of sensation or reflection, that is memory, are more vivid than ideas. Hume's copy principle therefore states that all our ideas are products of impressions. At first glance, the copy principle may seem too rigid. To use Hume's example, we can have an idea of a golden mountain without ever having seen one. But to proffer such example as counter to the copy principle is to ignore the activities of the mind. The mind may combine ideas by relating them in certain ways. If we have the idea of gold and the idea of a mountain, we can combine them to arrive at the idea of a golden mountain. The copy principle only demands that at bottom the simplest constituent ideas that we relate come from impressions. This means that any complex idea can eventually be traced back to genesis constituent impressions. In the treatise, Hume identifies two ways that the mind associates ideas, that is, natural relations and philosophical relations. Natural relations have a connecting principle such that the imagination naturally leads us from one idea to another. The three natural relations are resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. Of these, Hume tells us that causation is the most prevalent. But cause and effect is also one of the philosophical relations where the relate have no connecting principle, instead being artificially juxtaposed by the mind. Of the philosophical relations, some such as resemblance and contrariety can give us certitude, some cannot. Cause and effect is one of the three philosophical relations that afford us less than certain knowledge, the other two being identity and situation. But of these, causation is crucial. It alone allows us to go beyond what is immediately present to the senses, and along with the perception and memory is responsible for all our knowledge of the world. Hume therefore recognizes cause and effect as both a philosophical relation and a natural relation, at least in the treatise, the only work where he draws this distinction. The relation of cause and effect is pivotal in reasoning, which Hume defines as the discovery of relations between objects of comparison. But note that when Hume says objects, at least in the context of reasoning, he is referring to the objects of the mind, that is, ideas and impressions, since Hume adheres to the early modern way of ideas, the belief that sensation is a mental event and therefore all objects of perceptions are mental. But causation itself must be a relation rather than a quality of an object, as there is no one property common to all causes or to all effects. By so placing causation within Hume's system, we arrive at a first approximation of cause and effect. Causation is the relation between objects that we employ in our reasoning in order to yield less than demonstrative knowledge of the world beyond our immediate impressions. However, this is only the beginning of Hume's insight. Necessary connections and Hume's two definitions. In both the treatise and the enquiry, we find Hume's fork, his bifurcation of all possible objects of knowledge into relations of ideas and matters of fact. Hume gives several differentiates distinguishing the two, but the principal distinction is that the denial of a true relation of ideas implies a contradiction. Relations of ideas can also be known independently of experience. Matters of fact, however, can be denied coherently and they cannot be known independently of experience. Although Immanuel Kant later seems to miss the point, arguing for a middle ground that he thinks Hume missed, the two categories must be exclusive and exhaustive. A true statement must be one or the other, but not both, since its negation must either imply a contradiction or not. There is no middle ground. Yet given these definitions, it seems clear that reasoning concerning causation always invokes matters of fact. For Hume, the denial of a statement whose truth condition is grounded in causality is not inconceivable and hence not impossible. Hume holds that conceivability implies possibility. For instance, a horror movie may show the conceivability of decapitation not causing the cessation of animation in a human body. But if the denial of a causal statement is still conceivable, then its truth must be a matter of fact and must therefore be in some way dependent upon experience. Though for Hume this is true by definition for all matters of fact, he also appeals to our own experience to convey the point. Hume challenges us to consider any one event and meditate on it. For instance, a billiard ball striking another. He holds that no matter how clever we are, the only way we can infer if and how the second billiard ball will move is through past experience. There is nothing in the cause that will ever imply the effect in an experiential vacuum. And here it is important to remember that in addition to cause and effect, the mind naturally associates ideas through resemblance and contiguity. Hume does not hold that having never seen a game of billiards before, we cannot know what the effect of the collision will be. Rather, we can use resemblance, for instance, to infer an analogous case from our past experiences of transferred momentum, deflection and so forth. We are still relying on previous impressions to predict the effect and therefore do not violate the copy principle. We simply use resemblance to form an analogous prediction, and we can charitably make such resemblances as broad as we want. Thus, objections like under a Humean account, the toddler who burned his hand would not fear the flame after only one such occurrence because he has not experienced a constant conjunction are unfair to Hume, as the toddler would have had thousands of experiences of the principle that like causes like and could thus employ resemblance to reach the conclusion to fear the flame. If Hume is right that our awareness of causation or power, force, efficacy, necessity and so forth, he holds all such terms to be equivalent is a product of experience. We must ask what this awareness consists in. What is meant when some event is judged as cause and effect? Strictly speaking, for Hume, our only external impression of causation is a mere constant conjunction of phenomena that B always follows A, and Hume sometimes seems to imply that this is all that causation amounts to. And this notion of causation as constant conjunction is required for Hume to generate the problem of induction. Nevertheless, causation carries a stronger connotation than this, for constant conjunction can be accidental and therefore does not get us the necessary connection that gives the relation of cause and effect its predictive ability. Hume points out that this second component of causation is far from clear. What is this necessity that is implied by causation? Clearly, it is not a logical modality, as there are possible worlds in which the standard laws of causation do not obtain. It might be tempting to state that the necessity involved in causation is therefore a physical or metaphysical necessity. However, Hume considers such elucidations unhelpful, as they tell us nothing about the original impressions involved. At best, they merely amount to the assertion that causation follows causal laws. But invoking this common type of necessity is trivial or circular when it is this very efficacy that Hume is attempting to discover. We must therefore follow a different route in considering whatever impression of necessity amounts to, as causation at base involves only matters of fact. Hume once again challenges us to consider what we can know of the constituent impressions of causation. Once more, all we can come up with this is an experienced constant conjunction. Of the common understanding of causality, Hume points out that we never have an impression of efficacy. Because of this, our notion of causal law seems to be a mere presentiment that the constant conjunction will continue to be constant, some certainty that this mysterious union will persist. Hume argues that we cannot conceive of any other connection between cause and effect, because there simply is no other impression to which our idea may be traced. This certitude is all that remains. For Hume, the necessary connection invoked by causation is nothing more than this certainty. Hume's copy principle demands that an idea must have come from an impression, but we have no impression of efficacy in the event itself. Instead, the impression of efficacy is one produced in the mind. As we experienced enough cases of a particular constant conjunction, our minds begin to pass a natural determination from cause to effect, adding a little more energy to the prediction of the effect every time, a growing certitude that the effect will follow again. It is the internal impression of this energy that gives rise to our idea of necessity, the mere feeling of certainty that the conjunction will stay constant. Ergo, the idea of necessity that supplements constant conjunction is a psychological projection. We cannot help but think that the event will unfold in this way. Having approached Hume's account of causality by this route, we are now in a position to see where Hume's two definitions of causation given in the treatise come from. He gives similar but not identical definitions in the enquiry. He defines cause in the following two ways. First one, an object precedent and contiguous to another, and where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations of precedency and contiguity to those objects that resemble the later. Second one, an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determined the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. There are realms of literature addressing whether these two definitions are the same, and if not, to which of them Hume gives primacy. J. A. Robinson is perhaps the staunchest proponent of the position that the two are non-equivalent, arguing that there is an non-equivalence in meaning and they fail to capture the same extension. Two objects can be constantly conjoined without our mind determining that one causes the other, and it seems possible that we can be determined that one object causes another without their being constantly conjoined. But if the definitions fail in this way, then it is problematic that Hume maintains that both are adequate definitions of causation. Some scholars have argued for ways of squaring the two definitions. Don Garrett, for instance, argues that the two are equivalent if they are both read objectively or both read subjectively, while others have given reason to think that seeking to fit or eliminate definitions may be a misguided project. One alternative to fitting the definition lies in the possibility that They are doing two separate things, and it might therefore be inappropriate to reduce one to the other or claim that one is more significant than the other. There are several interpretations that allow us to meaningfully maintain the distinction between the two definitions unproblematically. For instance, first one can be seen as tracing the external impressions requisite for idea of causation, while the second definition traces the internal impressions, both of which are important to Hume in providing a complete account. As Hume says, the definitions are presenting a different view of the same object. Supporting this, Harold Noonan holds that the first definition is what is going on in this world, and the second definition is what goes on in the mind of the observer, and therefore, the problem of non-equivalent definitions poses no real problem for understanding Hume. Simon Blackburn provides a similar interpretation that the definitions are doing two different things externally and internally. However, Blackburn has the first as giving the contribution of the world, and the latter giving the functional difference in the mind that apprehends the regularity. However, this is not the only way to grant a non-equivalence without establishing the primacy of one over the other. Another method is to cash out the two definitions in terms of the types of relation. Some scholars have emphasized that, according to Hume's claims in the treatise, the first definition is defining the philosophical relation of cause and effect, while second definition defines the natural relation. Walter Ott argues that if this is right, then the lack of equivalence is not a problem, as philosophical and natural relations would not be expected to capture the same extension. This way of dismissing the non-equivalence of the two definitions becomes more problematic. However, when we realize that Hume does not make the distinction between natural and philosophical relations in the enquiry, yet provides approximately the same two definitions. If the definitions were meant to separately track the philosophical and natural relations, we might expect Hume to have explained that distinction in the enquiry rather than dropping it while still maintaining two definitions. Perhaps for this reason, Jonathan Bennett suggests that it is best to forget Hume's comment of this correspondence. Though this treatment of literature considering the definition as meaningfully non-equivalent has been brief, it does serve to show that the definitions need not be forced together. In fact, later in the treatise, Hume states that necessity is defined by both either as the constant conjunction or as the mental inference, that there are two different senses of necessity, and Hume at various points identifies both as the essence of connection or power. Whether or not Robinson is right in thinking Hume is mistaken in holding this position, Hume himself does not seem to believe one definition is superior to the other or that they are non-equivalent. Beyond Hume's own usage, there is a second worry lingering. Attempting to establish primacy between the definitions implies that they are somehow the bottom line for Hume's own causation. But Hume is at pains to point out that the definitions are inadequate. Although Hume does the best that can be expected on the subject, he is dissatisfied, but this dissatisfaction is inevitable. This is because, as Hume maintains in part 7 of the enquiry, a define is nothing but an enumeration of the constituent symbol ideas in the definitum. However, Hume has just given us reason to think that we have no such satisfactory constituent ideas, hence the inconvenience requiring us to appeal to the extraneous. This is not to say that the definitions are incorrect, not that he still applies the appellation just to them despite their appeal to the extraneous, and in the treatise he calls them precise. Rather, they are unsatisfying. It is an inconvenience that they appeal to something foreign, something we should like to remedy. Unfortunately, such a remedy is impossible, so the definitions, while as precise as they can be, still leave us wanting something further. But if this is right, then Hume should be able to endorse both definition 1 and definition 2 as vital components of causation, without implying that he endorses either or both as necessary and sufficient for causation. For these reasons, Hume's discussion leading up to the two definitions should be taken as primary in his account of causation rather than the definitions themselves. Let me summarize what we have discussed so far. Let us consider the impact that adopting these naturally formed beliefs would have on David Hume's causal theory. The function is twofold. First, It provides some sort of justification for why it might be plausible for Hume to deem mere supposition fit for belief. The other role is to answer the skeptical challenges raised by the traditional interpretation of the problem of induction. It would provide a way to justify causal beliefs despite the fact that said beliefs appear to be without rational grounds. It accomplishes the latter by emphasizing what the argument concludes, namely that inductive reasoning is groundless, that there is no rational basis for inductive inference. As Hume says, reason can never show us the connection of one object with another. In granting such a mechanism, we grant Hume the epistemic propriety of affirming something reason cannot establish. Further, it smoothes over worries about consistency arising from the fact that Hume seemingly undercuts all rational belief in causation, but then merely shrugs off the problem and continues to invoke causal reasoning throughout his writings. Now, you can try to answer the questions given here. What is the theory of causation? Where we can find Hume's most important contributions to the philosophy of causation? Which are the two ways that the mind associates ideas according to Hume? Define logical modality. What is this necessity that is implied by causation? How David Hume defines cause in the two ways? Now, you can go through these reference books for further understanding. A Treatise of Human Nature, written by David Hume, edited by David Fate Norton and Mary J. Norton, published by Clarendon Press, Oxford, UK in 2007. An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding by David Hume, edited by Tom L. Beauchamp, published by Clarendon Press, Oxford in 2000. The Idea of Necessary Connection in Reading Hume on Human Understanding, written by Edward Craig and edited by Peter Milliken, Oxford University Press, New York. Philosophy Guidebook to Hume on Knowledge, published by Routledge, written by Harold Noonan. Probability and Hume's Inductive Skepticism, written by David Stowe, published by Oxford University Press in 1973. The Skeptical Realism of David Hume, written by John P. Wright, published by University of Minnesota in 1983. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic soon. Have a nice day.